I'm Tracy Sable. Tonight on EWTN News Nightly, fight for the unborn. Pro-life groups are speaking out as White House officials protest the Dobbs decision. We have the latest. Financial errors. The Pentagon admits to sending fewer funds than reported over to Ukraine. We have analysis. A listening church. A new document presents hot-button topics for the upcoming Synod. We have a report from Rome. And keep wonder alive. Pope Francis sends words of encouragement to young astronomers. These stories and more tonight.
From EWTN, the Global Catholic Network, this is EWTN News Nightly.
Thank you for being with us on the feast of St. Aloysius Gonzaga. Our top story tonight, with just days before the anniversary of the historic Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade, the White House is going all out to push for abortion, and pushing back our pro-life groups in their efforts to save the unborn. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports. Owen.
Tracy, in just the last day or so, the President, Vice President, and First Lady all delivering remarks in support of abortion. Just last night at a campaign fundraiser in California, President Biden talking about, quote, the right of a woman to choose. The Vice President at a campaign function in Texas blasted the Supreme Court over the Dobbs decision from a year ago. Also, the First Lady called for codifying Roe.
First Lady Jill Biden hosts a pro-abortion roundtable Tuesday.
The Dobbs decision was devastating, and Joe is doing everything he can do to fight back.
And the First Lady went after pro-life measures passed by state legislatures across the country.
Today, 18 states have abortion bans in effect, and the consequences of these bans go far beyond the right to choose.
But SBA Pro-Life America warns
the Biden administration is the most extreme administration that's ever been in place on the issue of abortion.
And if you think the White House is just going to accept the High Court's decision of 1 year ago,
the way that his administration has been so extreme on this issue and disregards the lives of unborn children and the health and safety of women, that should be a wake-up call and appall all of us.
Meanwhile, the U.S. push to restore relations with China suffers a setback. Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with Chinese leader Xi Jinping on Monday to open the lines of communication. Then, at a political fundraiser last night, President Biden compared Xi to a dictator. China is furious. They say President Biden's comments were, quote, extremely absurd and irresponsible. Also overseas, the U.S. says Russia will pay for its war against Ukraine.
Even as we come together here in London, committed to supporting Ukraine's buildup, Russia continues to try to burn it down. Russia is causing Ukraine's destruction, and Russia will eventually bear the cost of Ukraine's reconstruction.
President Biden was scheduled to return here tonight from his trip out west, and he'll welcome to the White House India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi for an Oval Office meeting and a state dinner. Now, human rights advocates are urging President Biden to press Modi on religious freedom, since Christians and others face persecution in India. At the White House, Owen Jensen, EWTN News Nightly.
Well, a handful of Virginia senators lost their party's nomination in Tuesday's primary election, including Republican Senator Amanda Chase and Democratic Senator Joe Morrissey. Morrissey is a centrist pro-life Democrat who supports limits on abortion. A federal judge strikes down Arkansas's ban on so-called gender-affirming care for minors. The law would have prohibited doctors from providing hormone treatment, puberty blockers, and transgender surgery to children. The state attorney general says that he will appeal the decision. Well, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi has arrived in the U.S. for a state visit. He is going to be meeting with President Biden and addressing Congress. Lawmakers are hoping the president uses the visit to press him on religious persecution of Catholics and other religious minorities in his country. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales joins us now with more. Eric.
Well, good evening, Tracy. You know, Prime Minister Modi is being wined and dined while he's here in Washington, D.C. He's having dinner with President Biden tonight, that is, and then tomorrow he's going to have a state dinner at the White House. It's important to have good relationships with India, lawmakers say, but it's also important to remind India not to turn a blind eye when it comes to stopping religious persecution.
Prime Minister Modi has been directly responsible in the past and present for religious persecution. I mean, India is a great nation, but unfortunately its policies are very, very antithetical to Christians.
New Jersey Congressman Chris Smith and others say right now some of the worst attacks on Christians in a generation are happening in India's far eastern state of Manipur. Lawmakers tell me it's not just Christians, but the situation in India's Muslim community is also dire, with little to no police intervention.
We've got church burnings, a lot of them, that are happening around the country and seem to be just accelerating at this point. We're going to call on India's government to be able to say, we're glad you're here, we're glad we're friends and partners, but we also believe it's very important to be able to protect the basic rights of all individuals.
Congressman Smith also points out another major issue.
And they also have a huge problem with human trafficking. They have a huge problem with child abduction. I've had a number of cases in my own district, and I've even asked Modi himself. I introduced him to a mom who had her child abducted, and they did nothing to help. Nothing.
While none of the official White House statements mention China, this visit is all about China and its communist influence. As U.S.-China competition is only becoming more intense, India is one of the most important partners for the United States in the region.
The malign influence of China right next door and the threat that they present living right next door is something we have to always be mindful of when we're talking to the leadership in India.
Yes, the communist influence is very strong there. The United States Commission on International Religious Freedom says that the persecution is so serious for the first time since 2004. It's recommended that the State Department designate India as a country of particular concern. Now, that is a status that the Commission reserves for the worst of the worst. At the Capitol, Eric Rosales, EWTN News Nightly.
A Rwandan genocide suspect plans to apply for political asylum in South Africa. Fulgence Kayishema is one of the last remaining suspects accused of orchestrating the brutal massacres of the Rwandan genocide nearly 30 years ago. He was charged by a UN tribunal in 2001 of being a central figure in the murder of over 2,000 people seeking refuge at a Catholic church. He was arrested in May and has not entered a plea. Well, the president of Iran says that his country will not beg for a nuclear deal with the United States and other world powers.
ضمنی که پیگیری می‌کنیم بر اساس عزت، حکمت، مصلحت، التماس هم نمی‌کنیم.
In an interview last night, the leader also said that Tehran would not leave any current negotiations. Iran's economy has been hit hard by sanctions restored by former President Donald Trump back in 2018. Tehran has long said that its nuclear program is only meant for civilian purposes. And independent expert working with the United Nations is calling on the international community to help with human rights issues in Myanmar.
I came to Indonesia because the human rights situation of Myanmar and in Myanmar is dire and it's getting worse. And because I believe that Indonesia is positioned to play a critical role in the resolution of this crisis.
A special rapporteur and former U.S. Congressman Tom Andrews said that the Myanmar military has killed more than 3,500 people and jailed more than 19,000 since taking over the country in 2021. The country agreed on a peace plan 2 years ago. Little effort has been made to implement it. We have a lot more still to come here on EWTN News Nightly, including strong words. We take a deeper look at President Joe Biden's remarks about China's leader and the potential impact it could have, and what the new working document on the Synod on Synodality has to say about hot-button issues. Earlier in the newscast, China is responding to President Joe Biden, referring to its leader as a, quote, dictator. The president made the remarks last night just as the Secretary of State left Beijing. Chinese officials called the remarks, quote, extremely absurd and irresponsible. We go now to John Ullyot, managing partner of Brighton Strategy Group and former chief spokesman for the National Security Council. John, always great to have you on. First off, your thoughts on these remarks by President Biden and the timing, considering Antony Blinken's recent meeting with President Xi. What type of impact do you think this could have on an already strained relations?
Well, thanks for having me, Tracy. It's always good to join you and your viewers. I think that President Biden, he's frankly right. I mean, President Xi is a dictator, but to say that, especially in a donor setting, is not the smoothest move. And to your point, what it is this is going to be another test for him, and that he's teed up, and that's bad for him to have teed it up, because what it is he's either going to have to climb down from that statement, which is a true statement, and in which case he's going to damage himself politically because everybody knows that he's a dictator, or it just adds another pressure point in the mix right now, where you have here, just to review the bidding, you've got Tony Blinken going over to essentially cap in hand to meet with the Chinese government and the Chinese leaders, including Xi. And there was no deliverable that was on the table other than that they invited the foreign minister from China to come back here and meet with Biden as well. So it's sort of but there's nothing concrete, nothing on fentanyl, nothing on stopping the spy base that's going up in Cuba. There's nothing on human rights. There's nothing on anything about the pandemic. I mean, pandemic, which came from the Wuhan lab, has killed 1.1 million Americans and a little bit more than that. And yet there's been no call for, not even accountability. It's just transparency. People want to look and see exactly what happened at that lab, and there was nothing to that effect. So you got the spy issue, you've got the lab issue, you've got the fentanyl issue and whatnot. And so now you're just adding one more to the mix, where Biden's going to have to decide, do I tell the truth and do I admit this? Or do I go ahead and also submit to the Chinese on this issue as well and say, well, wait a minute, that was a mistake. You're not a dictator. Everybody knows he's a dictator. But by Biden putting that on the table, he's just adding pressure to his own relationship with China.
Yeah, it's a real quagmire there. On a different note, John, the Pentagon revealed that it overestimated the amount of weapons that it sent to Ukraine by more than $6 billion over the past 2 years. How does something like this happen? I mean, we're not talking about a few dollars here or there. I mean, it's a pretty big accounting error. And also, what's going to happen to that surplus?
Well, what it is right now is that this is a cry for more money from Zelensky. He's in the middle of his offensive right now, which has not gone well by his own admission. Actually, yesterday he admitted that it's a lot more slow going than he thought it was. And so this idea that there's $6 billion shortfall in what we've provided him, that just shows that, number one, there's not a lot of accountability, or accounting rather, on what's going on with those funds. That, let's just take a step back on this one as well. We have put out, the U.S. taxpayers have put out $160 billion to the Ukraine conflict, to helping Ukraine, both on the humanitarian level and then also tens of billions on the materiel, in other words, the actual war materiel level. And so if you're, first of all, that's a huge commitment by our taxpayers. That could build more than 10 of the best aircraft carriers that we have. And then that would help us against China in a big way. We've only got 11 carriers now. So this would almost double the fleet, or more than double the fleet of aircraft carriers. But look, that's a lot of money to be spending over there. And this just shows, once again, that there's no accountability for that money. And look, that's $6 billion. That's not pocket change. So they better get to the bottom of where that went.
Yeah, back here in Washington earlier today, as you know, Special Counsel John Durham testified before the House Judiciary Committee regarding his report into the FBI's probe into former President Trump's 2016 campaign and what was alleged to be possible ties to Russia at the time. John, what were your takeaways from this testimony today?
Look, I haven't followed the entire testimony because it was a long testimony, but the Durham report in general, and what he was testifying about, is the fact that there were found very transparent irregularities in terms of getting the whole probe about the Russia business going with President Trump, and that this was something that hobbled his presidency. I mean, he's a strong man, he can go through it, but this is something that was a dead weight that Democrats, through this dodgy dossier, put on the president in this completely baseless probe with Mueller, that President Trump had to overcome this, and he had to deal with this in addition to all the pressures on him from the office. And it just, what Durham's report showed is this was absolutely a fraud, and that it was known at the top levels of the FBI and the Justice Department that this was indeed a fraud. And it's just sad that, once again, this is something that he had to face. And if you see it, all the chips and bricks and whatnot that they're throwing at the president in so many ways right now in the different indictments and whatnot, number one, it's a disgrace that that's happening. Number two, it just only strengthens him with his own base, which is a good thing. And boy, he's a really resilient man. I was on his campaign in 2016 and was at the White House with President Trump. And look, we can't even keep up with the man. I mean, the man is approaching 76, 77 years old, and we're half his age, and we can't even can't even follow his schedule. So anyways, impressive man, but this just shows that Durham was right on the mark and people should pay more attention to his report.
All right, we're going to leave it right there. John, always great to be with you. Appreciate the insights.
Thank you, Tracy.
Up next on EWTN News Nightly, the working tool. We examine the new document spearheading the upcoming Synod on Synodality. Plus, Pope Francis says words of encouragement to young astronomers. Reported yesterday, the Vatican has released the working document for the upcoming Synod on Synodality. The text will be the basis for the participants and for those who have a vote, including laymen and women. EWTN Vatican Bureau Journalist Benjamin Crockett has more.
The just-released Instrumentum laboris is the working document of the Synod on Synodality and serves to establish the themes and define the priorities for the discussion to be held at the Vatican this October, when bishops, priests, men and women religious, and lay people from around the world will gather for 4 weeks. The document was presented yesterday during a press conference attended by Cardinal Mario Grech, Secretary General of the Synod of Bishops, and Cardinal Jean-Claude Ulrich, the Synod's Relator General, who is responsible for guiding the proceedings. The long global process held over the past 2 years collected the material that led to the drafting of this Instrumentum laboris. It is divided into 2 parts. The first, 26 pages and 60 points, is a reflection on synodality, while the second is made up of questions, directions for discernment, and the methodology for work. The questions for discernment by the participants include such hot-button topics as women deacons, priestly celibacy, and LGBTQ outreach, but attention is paid especially to authority in the Church.
I think that the peculiarity is the methodology that we are called to use in the Synodal Assembly. We are called to live a spiritual conversation that will help us, it helps us to live in communion, to search consents, and to live the harmony if we are open to listen one another, if we are open really to create space for not just to give answer, but to stay in the questions.
The Instrumentum laboris makes clear that it is not a magisterial document, nor is it a sociological survey or a complete elaboration of a theological vision, but it aims at the possibility of speaking and being heard in a language that seeks to be non-divisive, precisely to help mutual understanding.
I'm convinced that the Holy Father is insisting on this synodal process for a synodal church because he wants the church to become more spiritual, because the protagonist of a synodal church is the Holy Spirit.
The Instrumentum laboris also gives a description of what are the characteristic signs of a synodal church, a church of listening, of encounter, and dialogue, open, welcoming, and embracing all.
The holy people of God is a gift to the world, and it's the church. So if we really want to listen to the church, we have to listen to the holy people of God, where the Holy Spirit dwells.
One other novelty for this synod is the location. Instead of the new Synod Hall, the discussions will be held in the Paul VI Hall to accommodate the large number of participants. In Rome, Benjamin Crockett, EWTN News Nightly.
And for more analysis, we go to Matthew Bunson, Vice President and Editorial Director for EWTN News. Matthew, great to be with you as always. Explain to us, again, exactly what Pope Francis means by synodality. I mean, there seems to be a lot of confusion over this.
Yeah, one of the challenges that Pope Francis has had, as well as the leaders of the Synod, the Synod on Synodality, is actually helping people understand exactly what we mean by synodality. To add a synod on that topic, in some ways, has struck many people as so self-referential that it makes it even more difficult to explain what it is. Pope Francis has used very straightforward terms in his aspirations for synodality, as we've heard from Cardinal Grech in the reporting from Rome today. It is listening. It is accompaniment. The word itself, synod, is derived from the Greek for journeying together. In other words, the church is moving together. But that also entails listening, accompaniment. It pulls together some of the themes from Pope Francis, especially the idea of mercy, again, of that listening to those who are spread out in the peripheries. It's a challenge, however, because it at times seems so vague, especially when we hear, as we did even today and yesterday, references to the place of the Holy Spirit, and that we need to discern and listen to the Spirit. So it's not surprising that they're still struggling a bit to define what exactly synodality is, but clearly we have a blueprint, at least, for going forward in these discussions.
Yeah, on to the document itself now, Matthew. What are the biggest takeaways for you?
Yeah, well, as we were hearing, the hot-button issues are referenced here, but they're couched within a series of discernment questions. In other words, it is not simply proposed, as we see in other types of instrumentum labora, leading into different types of other synods. These aren't recommendations or proposals. These are questions that we're supposed to discern. The other major takeaway, I think, as was referenced by Ben Crockett in his reporting, is the strong focus in this instrumentum on authority in the church. And that itself is looked at from the perspective of transparency, of listening to the people of God, making sure that everyone is heard. It raises questions as to exactly who we're supposed to listen to when a suggestion is made, for example, as a discernment question, that should we listen to other ecclesial communities, such as the Anglicans, for example, or the Lutherans, as to how they have power structures within their own communities. But those are questions that we're going to have to address clearly because they're on this list for discernment. And I think that's one of the reasons why there has been a certain surprise that they made their appearance here. But obviously this is something that the Holy Father wants discussed.
Yeah, and what are the most important developments to watch for next when it comes to the Synod?
Yeah, I think there are three. The first is that, as Pope Francis himself has reiterated, as we hear from the organizers of the Synod, including especially Cardinal Mario Grech, this is not a parliament. This is not intended to be like an up-and-down democracy vote on what the Church believes. That's something I think we'll see stressed again in the coming months. The other big question is who exactly is going to be participating in the Synod. It was announced yesterday that we still don't have the lists. Pope Francis is going to have quite a bit of say in who's actually representing the people of God at the Synod. And then the other final one, which we won't really know until the end of the Synod in October, is what are the marching orders? What is supposed to happen within the Church and for the Church at the end of this Synod leading up to the October 2024 Synod. So that's one of the major questions that has yet to be answered.
Almost out of time, Matthew, but before we wrap up, I want to get to this. The leaders of the Synod stress that this is not a magisterial document nor a sociological study. That said, why is this so important?
Well, it's significant for them to note that. Again, we go back to what Francis has said, that this is not a parliament. So this document itself, this instrumentum, is not intended to have magisterial weight. In other words, this isn't a theological document as much as it is a guidebook or a blueprint for these discussions. In other words, the fear that somehow this is all going to lead to changes in church teaching is something I think they need, and they're going to some lengths to try to allay. Also, this isn't a sociological study. This is a reflection and discernment on the life of the church and the spirit in the church. So we have to be careful about pulling in the social sciences as we examine the church to the potential destruction of our own self-understanding of the church. And we need to be very careful in how we analyze and how we move forward in avoiding those social sciences, which we have seen play such a significant and deleterious role in the German synodal path that has just been concluded.
Well, Dr. Bunson, thank you so much, as always, for coming on and breaking this down for us. We really appreciate it.
Good to be with you.
Finally tonight, Pope Francis reminds young astronomy students to never lose their sense of wonder. In a message to participants in the Vatican Observatory Summer School, the Holy Father praised the great discoveries of astronomy. He also expressed excitement at the images from the James Webb Telescope. Summer School began back in 1986 and is usually held every 2 years. 24 students from around the world are selected out of a couple hundred applicants. They spend the summer at the Vatican learning from experts in the field. And we thank you for watching tonight. Remember, you can follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at EWTN News Nightly. I'm Tracy Sable. Good night and God bless.